So in 1908, the European sphere was in a period of great prosperity. There was certainly a lot of argument to be made that much of that prosperity was achieved on the backs of conquered lands. But nevertheless, prosperity it was. And at this point in time, the world was already starting to seem a little bit smaller than it had certainly even 100 years before. There were train networks everywhere, pretty much, and a lot of developments in architecture and in, obviously, radio was really up and coming. And generally speaking, people in the industrialized nations who could afford it were starting to travel more and see a little bit more of the world around them. And so it was a very exciting time, to be sure. Now, other things that happened were certainly perhaps troubling for the ruling classes of the period. Many labor revolts and rumblings of revolution in various vassal states, as well as European countries themselves. You would think naturally that a fear on the minds of those who were in power would certainly involve the revolt of the underclasses. And Herbert Wells, being a socialist, of course, and a member of the Fabian Society at this time, which was English society that was trying to push for social reforms, Wells often thought they were not bold enough. Mind you, his own ideas were sometimes ridiculed by other society members, like George Bernard Shaw, for being a bit too outlandish and simply making arguments out of these things that came out of his imagination. And he's like, here's my political argument, and come up with this crazy utopian concept that just seemed completely impractical. And they were in favor of adopting reforms at a much slower pace and perhaps not undermining the ruling status quo. And this maybe wasn't sometimes good enough for Wells, who was himself experiencing considerable prosperity at this time as a professional writer. And, of course, having been to America in 1906 and spent some time particularly around New York City, but he actually traveled around a fair bit, but he seemed to make New York his sort of base of operations, and he stayed there for quite a while, and he learned a lot and talked to a lot of people, and you can see the spirit that perhaps imbued his visit there, which he described sort of as a set of incredible contradictions of both positive and negative things. And then, so he churned out this book, and he wrote it in a period of 4 months, and it was not necessarily something that he apparently thought not all that much of, because I think at the time he was really trying to further himself as a realistic sort of writer of emotional, society-oriented fiction of domestic situations and sort of working class people and their struggles and stuff like that. And I think this was something that really sort of inspired him, and he actually got a little bit frustrated around this time that people still sort of hung on to his scientific romances. And it's kind of an unfortunate attitude, but one thing about Wells that I think is kind of cool and that we alluded to before is that he was never afraid to change his stance on things. And that could lead to a frustrating person who seems a mass of contradictions himself. And Wells certainly was that. He did speak in favor of eugenics for a time, like so many others did in the late 19th century. But at some point, he completely turned around his stance and sort of started seeing all the negative arguments against it and understanding them and speaking strongly against it. And other areas like his visiting the Soviet Union and his ideas formerly about what ideally might come of that institution were sort of disillusioned.
Yeah.
And there were a lot of other things that he kind of either softened on or turned around on at various points in his life. And I think that a lot of artists and thinkers are like that. They don't necessarily become dogmatic in the long term, although occasionally a person like Wells, maybe his work can seem a little bit like that. A lot of the things we've done so far, and most of the things we do, are going to be I mean, they will all be the scientific romances, and we're not going to cover a lot of his other work, but H.G. Wells wrote so much material, not just fiction, but reams and reams of essays, criticism, journalism, biography, science, biology, textbook that he wrote early on in his life.
He's basically writing nonstop for 50 years, it seems.
Yeah, and having quite a few adventures along the way. Certainly a person who definitely wanted to grasp as much of the world as he possibly could.
Yeah.
So we are not surprised that he wrote books about people flying through the air, and we shouldn't be. And perhaps we shouldn't be surprised that the main character of this book, our protagonist's name is Bert.
Yeah.
Although it stands for Albert, not Herbert. But anyway, we don't actually begin with Bert in War in the Air, which was published in 1908 by George Bell and Sons. Instead, we first spend a little time with his older brother, Tom Smallways. He's a grocer, and he laments progress. And he laments weird fruits and motor cars and balloons. And it just keeps on, doesn't it? And then his brother buys a motorbike. And Bert has no taste for the grocer business. In fact, he's likely to make off with the produce, turning it into his supply pack. He's kind of a wandering, nomadic person. He kind of reminds me of some punks from nowadays. And just very... We'll find out later, though. There are some things about Bert, and he's an interesting character, but very passive throughout this book.
Oh, yes, so, absolutely. Yeah.
Certainly, if you are the kind of person that demands that a protagonist sort of take front and center stage and like be doing things all the time, you will not really enjoy this book. So don't expect that from this book, because that's not what this book is like. Although, when things change towards the end, you may actually wish that they hadn't. And in any case, though, we're not nearly there yet, and Bert eventually comes to work in a bicycle shop, Grubb's. And Grubb is more like a friend to him than an employer. They pretty much, they're just buddies. The employer/employee status is really just, it's just for show. Bert has a real gift for riding and bicycles generally.
Very mechanically inclined.
Right, although Wells says he's more of a, let's have a look at it, an enamel chipping variety of engineer.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, he's kind of flying by the seat of his pants, but that's what bicycle engineers do.
Sure.
So Tom seems to grudgingly respect his brother, but his wife Jessica is always approbating with him, and she's kind of nagging at him all the time. And Aeromania, though, is really taking over. I don't know what we want to call that. Aeromania? I'm not sure.
I think Aeromania.
But Aeromania sounds pretty good.
Yeah.
Anyway, we get a funny sort of misidentification of Jules Verne here. I don't know if this is a... He refers to The Clipper of the Clouds and its popularity. He says it's written by George Griffith, which is worth pointing out because we will actually be covering one of his books next time. So stay tuned. But they live in Kent, near this aerodrome thing, which is called the Crystal Palace. And Bert sees this monstrosity ascending. It's a kind of little engine with a guy in it, pulled by a massive gas cylinder. And it's somewhat amusingly described. So kind of obviously, this is the sort of thing that Tom Smallways would just point and laugh at. And the flights do become more frequent, and Bert and his friend Grubb put up a joke sign in their shop that says aeroplanes repaired. Unfortunately, all the flights so far end in smashes of one kind or another.
Yep.
So
very much mirroring real life. I mean, a lot of these aviators in the real world were very public people as these daring adventurers, and their flights were well publicized, and even more publicized when they crashed into the ground.
Yes, definitely so. And we're going to see something like that very soon. But in the meantime, there has been a huge monorail network, pretty much monorail network set up everywhere, and the little cars are just zooming along up above the English Channel and stuff, and it's really some really interesting changes coming to England. But, he mentions the vanishing of the Wright brothers, so obviously they were on his spectrum at that time.
Yeah. I mean, worldwide famous.
Yes, yes. And everyone was waiting to see what they would do. And in an inn, Bert talks to a soldier who speaks ominously of an area that's been cordoned off and is used for air experiments. Kind of an Area 51 sort of vibe going on there, I thought, in retrospect. But he says for sure that the Japanese have it, and the Germans, maybe everybody. Now, there's this figure who is exactly one of those extreme, boisterous characters.
Yeah.
Who goes around very loudly. And his name is Alfred Butteridge. And he has a new sort of craft. It's a kind of described as a wasp-like vehicle that makes a droning sound. And he flies around and yelling at people from a megaphone while he's doing it about how he's an imperial Englishman.
Right.
And he's carrying on this really ridiculous romantic affair with some, I don't know who she is exactly. She said some kind of royalty figure or something, but yeah. I don't know. It's not really clear who the person is, but it's just kind of like Wells doesn't really seem to want to go into it. It's just too ridiculous for words.
Yeah, I don't know if you've ever seen Blackadder, but this character really reminded me of Lord Flashheart.
I have, but it's been a long time since I wanted to get back into it, so I actually started the first season, but I still haven't finished it. I watched a lot of the later ones when I was like 10.
Yeah.
I sort of remember that, though.
Yeah, it's a, I guess, cameo character played by Rick Mayall from the Young Ones. But it's this ridiculous, like, fighter pilot guy who's totally arrogant, loud, and boisterous, and yeah, that's the first thing that came to mind when this character comes in.
Yeah, I mean, he's pretty terrible, but that's pretty awesome.
Right.
So, and it's funny because whenever Wells seems to be, like, on the hint of describing his ridiculous affair, he kind of says, no, it's like he sort of implies that it's too boring and stupid to even talk about. So it's kind of funny because that happens consistently throughout. So I don't know I feel like he might be satirizing a particular thing.
I think so.
I'm not quite sure what it is.
I think so. I think it's that whole character of the glorious, loud airman, the macho adventurer guy. And as we see, it's not all glorious.
Right. Yeah, I don't know. I just thought maybe there was something very specific that he was alluding to with this. But he also, he embroils himself in a bunch of legal and financial, like, hijinks. And there's all these nasty rumors that start circulating about him, too. Like, that he was hanging out in Cape Town in South Africa, and he actually stole the formula for this new flying machine that he has from someone else. And his character is really ridiculous, but sort of charismatic, in a way. But he's very threatening, too, and he says he may not give his secret to England, after all, even though he is an imperial Englishman. And Bert is sort of reading about all this, and Bert harangues Jessica and Tom about the impending grim fate of the Empire and the looming war, and Jessica just gets him to carry potatoes. So Grubb, though, is offering Bert half share in the business, which is doing really badly. So it's his way of saying, well, I can't pay you, but... And they get harassed a bit, and they have to relocate, and the new digs are pretty low-grade and terrible.
Yep.
And there's some really silly, hilarious business with dogs, and business is on its death's door, essentially. And everyone's really upset with them, and they're not having a good time. So Bert has this girlfriend of sorts, and her name is Edna. She's not really in the book very much, but Bert's about to go on a lot of crazy adventures, and it's kind of the person that he's always thinking about when he's so far away from home. And the headlines are all about Mr. Butteridge and whom he's going to sell his secret to. And Bert and Grubb decide to shut down their affairs and sort of run off and be beach singers, which is pretty much the strangest idea for a career change that I've ever heard. Like, they're just going to hang around on the beach in silly costumes and sing for people. It's really bad.
The desert dervishes.
Yeah, dervishes. It's ridiculous. Of course, they're not impressing anybody. It's obvious. They look like idiots in their dervish costumes. But there's a balloon that comes down, and something is wrong with it, thinks Bert. And, of course, everyone's gawking, and it turns out to be, what do you know, but the balloon that contains Butteridge and his lady friend. And through some kind of weird antics, Butteridge and the lady tip themselves into the sea, but Bert hangs on and is taken up into the sky. And the people he sees milling far below him, and he's oddly calm as he drifts way, way up into the sky. And can start singing the song now, if you want. Now, Bert is up in the sky all by himself, and he doesn't know what to do. And it's quite frightening, as he really doesn't know what anything does, and he has no conception at all. So, in order to keep his mind off of it, he sets himself to the other things around him, and he notices a lot of picnic supplies. So it seems like Butteridge and his large blonde friend had this idea of going on a picnic. So food-wise and champagne-wise, he's certainly set.
Yeah, very well-stocked balloon.
Yes. And he decides to read Butteridge's stuff, and he finds a whole bunch of erotic letters. And he is suitably awestruck. And there's also a bunch of mysterious German letters that seem to be inviting him in his services somewhere, and they all have company names on them and stuff. And in a locker, there's a whole bunch of drawings and plans. So, he is lost in the air with the Butteridge secret. But wait, it looks as though some of the pages might be missing. But no worries, because he eventually realizes that the jacket he's pulled on, in order to try and stay warm, has papers sewn inside of it. So he kind of slashes it up and takes the rest of the papers. And Bert, he almost comes down in the ocean, but he remembers to drop some ballast. And that's pretty much all he knows to do. So he just keeps doing that and holding himself up in the air and sort of drifting and being carried by the wind. And it's actually quite a fun, relaxing excursion, almost. Like, I mean, Bert's a little frightened, obviously, and
right.
Maybe we, the readers, are a little bit worried for him, but all in all, it's quite calm.
It certainly could be a lot worse for him, that's for sure.
Yeah, and it really gave me a nice vibe, actually. Just, sort of up in the air in this balloon. It's very peaceful, almost. He does find himself among electric cables eventually, though, and that's pretty disturbing, because there are sparks flying everywhere. And he passes over what he thinks is a lovely town, but things start to go wrong, and Wells says, and then the chapter of adverse accidents began. And this is a really funny part. He lands on the gatehouse of this town, and he causes shitloads of damage. And the people are really not happy about it, and there's almost a riot in the streets. And he disengages his grapnel and floats up again, much to the disgust of the people below. And I don't know about you, but when I was a kid, I loved like slapstick destruction, and I still kind of do.
Yeah.
So this scene really cracked me up,
Yeah.
and I just thought it was really funny. I got actual real chuckles. So yeah, I mean, there's vegetables thrown at everything.
Right.
So, and he knows too that he's in Germany, and now military forces are shooting at him, and he's about to see the great German imperial secret. Now, when I was talking about the prosperity that was sort of thriving in Europe at this time, there are certain things about that prosperity that were perhaps worrying, in a sense, to some of the other nations, and there were some rivalries that began to develop, going back still a few decades, but especially around this time. And the fact that Germany was producing so much steel, for instance, was a really big deal. And what were they going to do with all this steel?
Yeah.
They overcame Great Britain, and this was a big deal because Britain was very proud of having the largest empire in the world and the most economically prosperous and the greatest city, that being London, of course. So, yeah. And Germany, it turns out, has an aeronautics park. And now that people are able to fly over it and see it from above, that's pretty much the perfect way to observe the aeronautics park. And they secretly work on their fleet of airships there. And they are fish-like German warships. Zeppelin descendants, most certainly.
Mm-hmm.
And they have very powerful engines, huge gas bags, and a head-like thing which holds the cabins and crew. And they have telegraph equipment, and they're capable of speeds of 90 miles an hour in good weather. So, not very fast, but certainly large and well-equipped. And the Germans shoot down Bert very smartly and decisively. So, throughout the book, Wells occasionally will halt the narrative to sort of describe the world situation. And it's not too invasive. I mean, it's interesting. There's only one time that I wish that he would sort of get on with the story, and he even seemed to acknowledge that. But that's pretty much towards the end. So here, and these little interjections are quite useful. And here we get a lot of Wells' own personality and views sort of injected into these. But he describes the arms race that's happening between the major powers at this time.
Certainly very prescient for the World War I buildup.
Right. So it's written in 1908, and it's meant to take place a couple of years after the writing of the book. So, I mean, in a way, you could say it dates quickly, but, I mean, if you're the kind of person that says, well, it didn't happen, did it? You probably aren't listening to this podcast.
Exactly.
I think that it's worthy to do a thing like this. I definitely think that Wells got a few things not right, but, I mean, that's not really the point.
Yeah.
He has a message here, and whether you like it or not, Wells can be a message man, and the message is a worthy message. So, I mean, I think we'll talk about it more when we finish the summary and sort of talk more about the book and the feelings around it. But so the arms race is pretty much a race between the U.S. and East Asia, which is China and Japan in this case. Generally have been at odds around this time, especially. But
for sure. Which is, I thought, kind of an odd pairing that Wells did here, considering they had wars and things like that. But
the depiction of Asian there's not really any Asian characters, but the depiction of Asian society is probably one of the weak points of the book.
I agree.
And there's also the German alliance, and the British are considered a lesser power, along with the French and Latin powers. And unlike Robert Chambers, Wells pretty much saw Russia as falling apart and not really having much real influence in the world at this time.
Right.
Germany and the United States are very much at odds, which is kind of funny because of all the things the Germans picked to disagree with, it's the Monroe Doctrine in the States. And so I think Wells was definitely he lampoons a lot of countries in this, but the Germans get the brunt of it, I think.
Oh, absolutely.
Definitely. And there's even a preface in the edition that I read that seems to... I don't know who the person that wrote this is, actually. It's quite odd. They just go by their initials. And this is something that I actually meant to look up but forgot about. But he pretty much talks about... It's obviously a good 20 years or so after the book was initially published. And it's very short, and he just kind of talks about Wells being... the things that he perhaps didn't get right because he anticipated the German spirit, which nobody else did at the time. And indeed, I mean, a lot of these countries, they might have been at odds in some ways, but they were all hobnobbing at this time. You know, they were all hanging out, and there were a lot of commissions and different things, and we're at the first point in European history, I think, really, where everyone was trying to sort of really get together on things, but there was still a lot of, I guess, not so much international law and stuff like that, so, and not a lot of knowledge sometimes about what your neighbors were doing, so it's kind of an interesting, tense time, I suppose. But getting back to the story, Bert is mistaken for Butteridge, and he's taken to a cabin by some soldiers and presented with a lieutenant, or lieutenant as the British would call it, Kurt. He's a friendly young guy who speaks perfect English, and he just finds out that he is on an airship, and they lift off. And they're headed for America to trounce them, apparently. And Bert is thinking about what he's going to do at this point, and he decides that he can sell Butteridge's secret and make some money. While he's in his new stateroom, living it up, he makes copies of all the documents, and he makes a funny mistake, though, because it turns out that he really underestimates the value that country would pay for a secret like that.
Yeah. Yeah, he wanted to fleece them for £20,000, thinking that that's going to be more than they'll pay. But I think he finds shortly that the counter offer is £100,000, which really takes him off guard.
Yes, and he is told this by this Graf von Winterfeld, who's this sort of interesting, very observant-seeming character with this smile that Bert finds very troublesome. And yes, he tells Bert that Germany is prepared to offer £100,000, and Bert is sort of caught off guard and starts sputtering and stuff. And the Graf tells Bert the plan is to terrorize and dominate America. And they're going to build a depot for German ships, and Butteridge will be head engineer. And apparently he had been negotiating with the Germans and had made all these weird demands. He wanted to be called Baron. Yeah. Now, this is something else that you should be aware of if you read this book. There's a lot of I dialect. So that, of course, means that people have their accents imitated by the writing, and that's certainly fallen out of favor.
Oh, it definitely has.
In recent times. I personally kind of like it, because it means I get to try silly accents every now and then, but I don't recommend writing like this, because it actually took me a while to figure out what Winterfeld was saying.
Yeah.
He said, Butteridge demanded that he be called Paron. And I'm like, Paron? What? What? Wait a minute. And no, it's because he's German, and he can't pronounce B's, you see.
It's a thick German accent,
Yeah. We also get, every time Bert talks, though, we get his accent, too. So it's even-handed.
Right, it's just like Cockney kind of accent that he talks in, or I guess what the equivalent would have been in 1908, because presumably the accent's changed.
And Kurt is he's an actual Rhodes Scholar, so he speaks perfect English. He's the only character, pretty much, that doesn't have an accent in this book.
Right.
It's kind of funny. Winterfeld is really too much for Bert, and Bert actually crumbles, like literally crumbles under his stare, and he's like sort of not quite sure what hot water he's getting into here, because he feels like the real Butteridge, who's probably still alive, is going to come after him, and he doesn't know about all this, like being the air chieftain and stuff. It's going to, obviously he doesn't know anything about that stuff. So he's sort of burbling on about how he wants to be anonymous now, and his real name is Albert Smallways, or that's what he wants to be known as. Well, of course the Graf knows, and he's been sort of sighing at him this whole time. And Bert makes a clean break of it, and it's very deflating.
Yeah.
But strangely, though, the Graf appears to start confiding in him at this point, and this is something that I found very strange about this book, was how nice the Germans were to Bert. I don't find it a problem, because I thought it was amusing and kind of sweet, but it is weird. It's definitely, I don't know how realistic that is. Like, you would think they would just throw him off the ship, like, right then and there.
Yeah, and they certainly do with other German officers that disobey certain rules.
Right.
We'll see in a bit.
But maybe it's because, I guess he's not one of them. But then again, like, there weren't really too many regulations around then about, like, prisoners of war and stuff.
Definitely not. Yeah.
And he's not like he's a prince or something like that, right? Like, he's just Bert Smallways. So, like, they could throw him out of the ship any day.
Bicycle repairman.
Right. And the person that does want him off the ship is the Prince, Karl Albert. And this is his ship.
Yeah. It's pretty much the flagship.
Yes, this is the flagship of the German fleet. And it's funny the way Winterfeld phrases this, because he's confiding now in Bert everything. And he says that the Prince is romantically interested in him, of the character that he pretended to be. And by romantically, of course, he doesn't mean necessarily what conclusion we would jump to now, but it is a kind of a funny double entendre.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he calls Butteridge his star. And now he'll be terribly disappointed. And Bert's like, well, they were no more Butteridge's plans than mine. And I thought this was kind of fun. Winterfeld just said, you don't need to say anything. It's like, he knows everything, and he understands everything, and the Graf is going to sort of take charge at this point.
Yeah.
And he even offers to pay Bert £500 from his personal stash. So it is pretty nice, all things considered. But there's an audience with the Prince where Winterfeld pretty much reveals everything. And it seems like this kind of funny because he could have taken it in another direction at this point, and I think this is kind of where things start to sort of change, because from this point, it's been like a pretty fun caper, a real romp. I kind of thought, oh, Bert's going to continue to pretend to be Butteridge for the prince, right? Because why wouldn't he? But no, that's not the way it goes at all. I mean, I thought that Winterfeld was confiding in him because he was going to be like, well, we can't risk the prince's anger and you have to keep up the ruse. And nope, this is not some kind of silly spy caper, not at all. So Bert pretty much goes out like a leaf before a gale. The prince is a very intimidating personality, and he's very large and very German and very regal in a pompous sort of way.
He's certainly not pleased with these recent developments of Bert not being Butteridge.
No. But he does have a friend in Lieutenant Kurt, and he has showed him around the ship. And it's a really ingenious design. Everything's super light, from the tables and chairs. There's springy cushions everywhere, and even the crockery is made of some super light new German steel alloy. And there's all kinds of, it's a lot of contingency that they've taken. And Wells describes it in some detail, and it's really cool, actually. And men can climb around in ladders and tubes in the infrastructure, and they can even enter the gas bag to make repairs wearing special diving suits. Now, since everything is out, Bert has to room with Kurt in his much smaller cabin, of course. So the two of them really have a bit of they become friends, essentially, and it's a nice relationship. But the wireless brings news of a great battle in the Atlantic, and the German Navy and the American North Atlantic Squadron are engaged. And Kurt is very enthusiastic about naval battle. He came from a ship, as did many of the people on board the German airship. And the people on board really, most of them don't know the first thing about flying. So they're in for something, most certainly. And America has expected war in the Pacific with Japan. So it is taken completely by surprise by Germany. And I don't think they're very happy with Britain either, because it seems like Britain was supposed to be like almost the watchdog in that part of the Atlantic, and they didn't like warn them.
Yeah, that's the sense I got too.
And so essentially international affairs are starting to crumble, but we get this from a very detached perspective. We don't spend time in this book in the meetings of politicians and royal figures and stuff like that. They're very removed from this, except of course for the prince and his little army that he's established. And it seems like the majority of Americans do not believe the rumors of a massive German air fleet headed their way. But they will soon have to face reality. And Kurt is wondering how his old ship, the Barbarossa, is doing. And, well, the reports are coming in, though, and the Barbarossa, in fact, has been sunk, and Kurt is quite affected. And the German Navy is taking a bit of a beating, and men toil and die. And this is definitely the beginning of a theme that takes over the rest of the book.
Yep.
From here on out, folks, it's pretty grim. So Kurt is already starting to see the war a little bit differently, and his enthusiasm's tempered by fear and awe and a certain morbidity. The air fleet glides over the ocean, and they're kind of taunt. They're not even bearing guns at this point, but they're so confident and so high up in the air. They know that nothing can get to them. The airships are passing over the battle, and they see firsthand all the destruction, but everything looks so small and far away. And there's just a few steamers left. And the way the battle is described is it's quite horrible. Like these huge steam ironclad battleships coming apart in burning, boiling flames, and all the men on board dying in the most horrible ways.
Yeah, and, getting sucked under the sea. And he really captures a sense of confusion here, where Bert just has no idea of what's going on other than stuff is blowing up. He can't identify who is who, and he's just really at a loss to what's happening below him.
Yeah. And everybody on board the ship is very sober and withdrawn, and a young soldier gets shot, and the prince is very callous and just sort of gestures dismissively at the body, and he says, "Dispose of it." And they also execute a man on one of the airships because he had a box of matches. And of course, that's against the rules, and he probably just forgot. I mean, people who smoke, they always carry matches, right? And you can't smoke on the airship, but that doesn't mean that you forget your matches necessarily. And, well, he pays the price. And it does seem like a severe sentence, but with all the flammability of airships being well known, even at this time, and this is pre-Hindenburg, but nevertheless.
Yeah, still, hydrogen catches on fire pretty easily.
Yeah, you can sort of understand why they did it. But it didn't go well because they actually hang him above the ship, but something goes wrong when they throw him overboard with the rope, and his head pretty much comes right off, and it's a really gory scene that everybody has to witness, and Kurt is really affected by everything. But they get to New York, and now there's a bunch of talk about New York and what it's like, and Wells has been there recently, so his description has some weight to it, I think. It's not just something he made up.
He specifically makes the point to say that it surpassed London as the cultural and economic capital of the world.
Yeah, he describes it as violent and partially lawless. And most of North America is confident they aren't going to be affected by war. So there is some preparedness, though, on the part of the American military. They also have some secret airships. And there are, in fact, that soldier that Bert was talking to early on was right. And in fact, they are quite prevalent. And in secret, nations all over Europe and elsewhere have been building them. Here we go with the Germans invading New York and New Jersey again. We had that last episode as well.
Yeah.
Now, over the city, there are all these airships deployed. And Washington tells them to surrender, but New York says, hell no! And they eventually do, though, or at least officially. But only officially. The government, of course, bunch of yellow traitors. So all the people, or many of them at least, deliberately go against that order. And there's a huge amount of fighting going on. But the German airships are just sort of in the air, dropping bombs and destruction on everything. And there's not really a lot that the people can do. They also go to Niagara and they take over that town as well. And they intend to use that as a base. Back in New York City, though, a gun is set up near City Hall, and they manage to take down an airship. And unfortunately, it explodes and causes this huge fire and massive amounts of damage. Surrender is completely meaningless. And unfortunately, because of all the fire and destruction, the city is pretty much destroyed in a massacre and conflagration. We have an air battle over Manhattan Island. And there's really bad weather messing with the German ships as well. And aeroplanes, little smaller airplanes that are shooting at the airships. And the Vaterland, which I actually forgot to name before, but that's the name of the ship that Bert and his friends are on, is disabled. And Bert's knocked unconscious. And Bert hides in a locker, pretty much wishing he was dead. And Americans try to board, but they're mostly shot down. And Bert's oblivious to everything and just hides and thinks panic thoughts of death and has a fit in the locker, pretty much banging and screaming until Kurt opens it and flings him out, and they start to roll around punching each other, and it's very cathartic. And Kurt explains that there's been a terrible fight. Everything is scattered everywhere, and they've blown completely off course. And he thinks they're flying somewhere over Canada, but they're pretty much clueless. And the engine is pretty much destroyed. And Kurt and Bert have this bonding moment, and Kurt reveals just how cynical and bitter he is, and everything affects him. And he says, though, that Bert has to finally make himself useful, and he does. And Bert is a man who does what needs to get done, and he's very good at this, and he's sort of adaptable in this way, which I think Wells thinks might be part of the English spirit of a person like Bert. Maybe not a pampered English aristocracy, but the real working class people. And Vaterland passes over seeing this tribe of natives somewhere. I don't know exactly where they are. Later on, they end up in Labrador. But anyway, they can't communicate with anyone, so von Winterfeld is killed when the airship has a really bad landing. So there goes another Bert's allies. But actually, he's okay on the ship now. He actually does seem to be, I mean, he's obviously no soldier. And so again, I'm sort of surprised that the men just sort of get used to him. And he's like, oh, it's that guy that speaks English. And,
well, I think he kind of proves himself fixing up the ship and doing repairs and things like that. And shows that he can actually do stuff rather than just be a nuisance.
Exactly. He's a guy that gets done what needs to get done. And I think that's the theme throughout the book. And it is great in a way, but it's also perhaps unfortunate. And we'll get to that. But the world is at war, and many of the major cities have been burned. He's received the messages from the telegraph. And so Hamburg, Paris, London, Berlin, they're all destroyed. And Japan has attacked San Francisco. And it turns out that Japan-Chinese alliance has also airships, and they've taken this chance to swoop in and dominate this part of the world. And it's a bit Yellow Peril-ish, but it's not too bad. Like, he does make a point of expressing the foolishness of xenophobia in general. And I think the point is that any of the nations here would have done the same thing.
Right. I think he's trying to comment more on a global war scenario and how that opportunistic empires will see any chance to strike first. I mean, the German assault on the American forces was a first strike because they thought it was a strategic advantage. And this Chinese-Japanese alliance sees the Germans attack the Americans, and they use that opportunity to launch a sneak attack against the Pacific. And it is unfortunate that he does treat them as a monolith rather than the separate empires that they are, but he doesn't really belabor the point too much.
What I should have said in the beginning, I was looking for the word, but the unfortunate thing about it is that it's a bit horde-like.
Yeah, it is.
Like what you said, the monolith.
Right.
It's just a horde. And there are none, I mean, this is obviously Bert's journey, and he's very distanced from any of these people, so you can't really expect them to be characters, but it is a horde. But Bert and Kurt and the crew of the Vaterland, minus a bunch of people who have died now, including von Winterfeld, are for now settled in Labrador, which is a very kind of peaceful interlude, but it's quite melancholy. Bert and Kurt have been spending a lot of time together, and they've started to talk about their sweethearts. So it's getting there. It's to that point now, and Kurt knows that he won't survive, and he just knows this, absolutely. And Bert tries to cheer up his friend and be confident, and it's kind of funny because it feels almost like this is a commentary on the English versus German spirits almost, and both of them are a little bit absurd. I mean, one is super fatalistic, and the other is really optimistic. Almost. One is stiff upper lip, and the other is like, we're all doomed, and like dour and grim. And it's poor Kurt. You really feel for him at this point because he's so fatalistic that you probably think, like he will. I mean, he's going to be borne out. He's going to be right. He ruminates on the constancy of war and how it really wasn't something that he noticed before. And it's kind of a strange thing. And there's a lot of rumination like that. And Bert just sort of listens. Bert's a very sort of passive person. He tries to bolster his friend when he can, but he doesn't really know anything about politics, and he hasn't really thought about this before either. So we get some descriptions of the Asian aircrafts that are flying around now, and they're light, fast, and efficient at fighting, and they're run by samurai.
Yeah. They kind of reminded me of the Zeros that the Japanese used in World War II, which are, again, the same thing, very light, very nimble, and often flown as kamikazes, used as rams.
Yeah, and they'd be pretty fearsome to combat because these little aircraft, they're one-man aircraft, and the guy has a projectile weapon that fires oxygen bullets. He also wields a sword, and the aircraft have these claw-like appendages that they use against airships. And it's a really great weapon to be used against airships because, and another thing that Wells commented on during the fighting already is that airships couldn't really fight other airships very successfully. It would be very difficult. Right. These Niai aircraft have a way of doing this, and that's pretty clever. But the world state continues to collapse. The international business world pretty much ceases to exist at this point. Banks refuse to make payments. There's no such thing as credit, ever. And police and governments have emergency powers everywhere. and it becomes clear that some kind of ultimate destruction is imminent. And indeed, the Great Collapse has already been referred to a few times. So this is, I believe, well, it's okay. It's our second instance of an apocalyptic book.
Yeah.
The first being The Last Man. And I think you maybe like that book a little more than I did. It was sort of long and not that, I don't know, not that compelling to me sometimes, but there were really good passages that really evoked the desolation of an apocalypse. And this is a very different kind of apocalypse.
Oh, yeah.
Wells also has a very evocative way
He does.
of
He definitely
portraying
does.
this. Yeah. And several battles are briefly gone over. And finally, there's the Battle of Niagara between Germans and Asians, or Asiatics, as Wells always calls them, a term that's certainly not used anymore. But the remaining German ships end up surrendering to the Americans, and the initial conflict is almost wiped from history, which is quite interesting.
Yep.
And in fact, it's hinted that there are a lot of gaps in history now. And the Zeppelin came to pick up the Germans from Labrador because the Vaterland is pretty much useless now. When the conflict started, a bunch of the Germans, and seemingly not all of them, but they just sort of took off in the Zeppelin. So they left Bert behind, and Bert's right around the falls, and he's hanging out like on the bridge to Goat Island. And after doing some heavy work on the German air fleet, the Asians land, and they take Niagara while Bert is hiding. The German Zeppelin smashes the main bridge, and there's this huge fireball. This point is where I said R.I.P. Kurt, because, yeah.
Yeah.
But we're not quite done with that yet. Just keeps getting worse and worse. Bert watches Chinese soldiers massacre the remaining men at Niagara. Most of those men are civilians, and everything seems to be dead. Bert thinks it's the sunset of the race. He's starting to have profound existential thoughts. And I'm going to read a quote now. This is Bert alone in Niagara, not having any idea what to do and trying to survive. And he says, he's reflecting, "He did not at first envisage his own plight in definite and comprehensible terms. Things happened to him so much of late. His own efforts had counted for so little that he had become passive and planless. His last scheme had been to go round the coast of England as a desert dervish giving refined entertainment to his fellow creatures. Fate had quashed that. Fate had seen fit to direct him to other destinies, had hurried him from point to point, and dropped him at last upon this little wedge of rock between the cataracts. It did not instantly occur to him that now it was his turn to play. He had a singular feeling that all must end as a dream ends, that presently surely he would be back in the world of Grubb and Edna and Bun Hill, that this roar, this glittering presence of incessant water, would be drawn aside as a curtain is drawn aside after a holiday lantern show, and old, familiar, customary things reassume their sway. It would be interesting to tell people how he had seen Niagara. And then Kurt's words came into his head. People torn away from the people they care for. Homes smashed. Creatures full of life and memories and peculiar little gifts. Torn to pieces, starved, and spoilt. He wondered, half incredulous, if that was indeed true. It was so hard to realize it. Out beyond, was it possible that Tom and Jessica were also in some dire extremity? That the little greengrocer's shop was no longer standing open, with Jessica serving respectfully, warming Tom's ear in sharp asides, or punctually sending out the goods. He tried to think what day of the week it was, and found he had lost his reckoning. Perhaps it was Sunday. If so, were they going to church, or were they hiding, perhaps in bushes? What had happened to the landlord, the butcher, and to Buttridge, and all those people on Dymchurch Beach? Something, he knew, had happened to London. A bombardment. But who had bombarded? where Tom and Jessica, too, being chased by strange brown men with long bare swords and evil eyes. He thought of various possible aspects of affliction, but presently one phrase ousted all the others. Were they getting much to eat? The question haunted him, obsessed him. If one was very hungry, would one eat rats? It dawned upon him that the peculiar misery that oppressed him was not so much anxiety and patriotic sorrow as hunger. Of course, he was hungry. So that, I think, that's a really powerful passage, and I think that in a lot of war stories, you definitely see things like this when things get really bad for the characters. You start really thinking about what it's like elsewhere, what it's like back home, whether your people are okay, and fearing that they probably aren't. And it's this really horrible feeling. And then Wells does a really good job of sort of transferring that to the empty feeling of Bert's stomach. Because, he's starting slowly to think more and more about food.
Right.
And he's sort of got this, free association thing going on. He's thinking about the grocer, and he's thinking about the landlord and the butcher, and he's thinking about, would they eat rats? And, hey, I'm hungry. And he's a funny character, and you get a lot of his he talks to himself a lot. And it's quite endearing, actually, and you really grow fond of Bert, and you want him to be okay. Even though he's a very passive character, he's not a nothing character, necessarily. He may be a bit of an English stereotype, I guess, but he's a very lovable character, I think. So he surveys some wrecked airplanes, and this is where he finds Kurt's body floating in a stream, and he's very distressed. And he remembers how Kurt had told him when he gets out of all this to deliver a letter to his lady friend, and he realizes that he never even got the letter. And Bert's almost frightened to death by a tiny kitten, and this becomes his new companion. This tiny cat wandering around Niagara, and it's cool. But then who should he see but the prince, Karl Albert himself. And the person that used to have the stateroom that he temporarily occupied, who's never named throughout the book, but he's this very threatening, austere, bird-like man who's an officer of some kind. And the two Germans instinctively hate him. And the prince, there's this abandoned Drachenflieger, which is the name of the little German fighter crafts that they have. So they did actually have not just the airships, but they had these little, one-man crafts as well. But they're described as being quite inefficient and not really reliable.
Yeah, the Asian design seems to be the vastly superior one for these kind of light fighters.
Right. And that's unfortunate for anybody in a Drachenflieger.
Right.
But the prince wants Bert to repair it, and so that he can fly off in the Drachenflieger, I guess, to safety or somewhere. And Bert is not necessarily such a meek person anymore, though. He's been through a lot, and he just saw his friend die, and he was really upset about it, really tore him up inside. So he's not really taking all this shit from the Germans, and he's talking back to them and being really quite pugnacious himself. He goes on a huge tirade against the prince and imperialism and everything, but nobody understands anybody, so there's a lot of cross-shouting, and it's kind of fun, actually.
The prince is pretty much the symbol of German imperialism. I mean, he's literally the leader of this whole First Strike initiative.
Yeah, and he's a very pompous, uncaring person. He's pretty much always described in very dislikable terms. But Bert finds the fallen Chinese man's gun, and this is a really great thing for him. Bert threatens the prince and the officer for food, because at this point they've secreted away the rest of the rations that were in the shed somewhere, and Bert can't get to them. And he's not having this crap anymore, and the prince and the officer run for their lives. They also have a gun, though, and start shooting, and Bert is worried about his kitten. And Bert realizes that he can't sleep with the Germans on the lookout for him, so it's a stalemate.
Yeah, although they have the advantage because they can take shifts where he can't.
Yeah, so obviously his only choice now is that he has to kill them. And so Bert, being a man who does what needs to get done, does it. and he shoots the prince with an oxygen bullet, and the gore is quite extreme, actually.
Yeah, I was surprised by this. It feels real like 70s exploitation kind of movie, you know?
Yeah, it's just really funny. I saw on Facebook recently, Ed, who's occasionally a listener of our podcast, was reading a book of H.G. Wells' short stories, and although I think that he didn't like some of the stories, I mean, obviously short story compilations can be hit or miss, he observed that they were surprisingly gory, and definitely in books like The Island of Dr. Moreau,
Yeah,
and even War of the Worlds, and this one, there is quite a lot of description of gore, and
sure.
it's pretty good, actually, so yeah. But the officer runs away, and Bert never really sees him again. Just one time, and the guy's all wounded and messed up, and he can't bear to shoot him. So I guess that guy dies in horrible misery and pain. But now Bert's going to fly, and he takes the kitten. He's worried that she's too young and civilized. And he has this flying machine working. I guess his bicycle engineer experience paid off.
Yeah, he didn't even need to do that much work on it, because there were the 2 Asian fighters that crashed, but one of them was perfectly intact except for the wings. So he just really swapped the wings off one and put it on the other. And I guess had the engineering know-how to verify that the engine was okay.
Mm-hmm, yeah. He does take off in the machine, but it's quite a contrast to the really relaxed, kind of cool, I have really good vibes from this balloon journey. Like, it's harrowing. It's
very stressful.
Utterly terrifying. He's being buffeted around. He's no idea what he's doing. He keeps, like, pushing the thing up, and it's flying higher and higher into the air. And it's really terrifying. But eventually he sort of crashes into a tree, I guess, and he's pretty much okay, which is awesome, but manages to get himself down. I guess he was one of those lucky people who sort of crashed and didn't manage to hurt themselves that badly.
Right.
I was definitely scared for Bert at this point. He meets this American guy who can only speak Czech, so they get nowhere communicating, and they don't seem to have the energy to even try to communicate, which is kind of funny. And he realizes he needs to arm himself when he sees this large, threatening black dog, and the gun was left in the flying machine. He learns that he's in a place called Tenuta, and there's a funny scene. The Americans, and he goes to this store. Not a shop! This is not a shop, this is a store!
Right.
And he goes to there and meet, and it's kind of like a combination, I guess, store, eatery, tavern kind of thing.
Yeah.
Sounds like a pretty good place to hang out, actually. But there's a bunch of men there, and they're all pretty ignorant. And, of course, they won't accept his shilling. But they're interested in the flying machine. And eventually they do offer Bert some food. And beer, which is
even more important, yeah.
Right. And Bert is very grateful, and he starts to do something that he does very well, and talk. But he leaves out a lot of the most fun parts at first because he wants to be simple and correct, he says, and not come across like a buffoon.
One very minor detail here that I thought was interesting is that a lot of the signs in the shop are in Esperanto, which I guess was more popular then than it is now. And I guess Wells envisioned that as being more of a successful language adopted worldwide than it actually became.
Yeah, definitely. In one of the historical works that I looked at, they do talk about Esperanto, and that it was sort of considered a going thing that might become even more significant at that time. So, yeah. But yeah, the whole thing is sort of charming. He takes them to the flying machine and finds his kitten, who sort of wandered off earlier, and they want to use the machine for defense, and they're being bombarded by the Asians regularly, and they go around destroying weapons and communications, you name it. And amusingly, Bert hears that Butteridge died of apoplexy in Dymchurch rather suddenly, presumably quite soon after losing his plans.
Right,
finding out that that's what had happened. His secret vanished with his soul. And in an utterly awesome scene, the Americans lament the loss of the Butteridge machine and its plans, and Bert has a fit. And he's all, I have them!
Yeah.
And he tears off his clothes, and the plans are sewed in there, in the jacket. And one of the Americans says, irony! Real, right down irony! And Laurier, a leader in town, is a very Canadian name, I thought. I mean, maybe it's just because his famous figure in one of the only famous figures in Canadian history, but I got so sick of Wilfrid Laurier in grade 10 history, let me tell you. A roving force now, and Laurier is kind of the leader of this new band, I guess. And they end up finding the president of the United States hiding in a saloon in Pinkerville on the Hudson River. And they give him the plans. But nothing really comes of that. So there's more rumination on the civilization and what we had and what would have been and what we would have lost. Money vanishes. Extremists take over all over the world. Britain's quashed. Indian revolts. Islamic jihadis everywhere. China rising up. And the Europeans doing the rest of the business against each other. Universal chaos. Famine. It's just, it goes on for a while. And there's a new plague in town, too, called the Purple Death. And it makes short work of a hell of a lot of people. Finally, we get back to our story. And that's the one part I think that maybe it's just because we've seen so many, like, apocalypse novels in general at this point, that I kind of wish that part was a little bit shorter, but it wasn't a big deal. So we finally get back to Bert because Wells acknowledges that we want to know about him. Well, things have really changed for Bert, and Bert has found Edna, and he's back home. He managed to get a lift from Boston on ship, and it's described as a very harrowing voyage. Wells doesn't really go into it, but it seemed like there were a lot of adventures, and once again, Bert pretty much had to prove himself, this time on the high seas. And Bert has arrived just in time for the Purple Death on a pleasant June day. And things have really changed inside Bert as well. He's a much more steely and remorseless person than he used to be. And Bert actually has to oust the bullies from the land. It's very Wild West. And the bully is a racist dick, too. And this is a fellow who is wooing Edna. So, he's described by her as fallen a-wooing with great urgency among the troughs of slush. Because Edna's been sort of manning a farm all this time. And, it's been a really hard life. And I guess Tom Smallways still around. We don't see him yet. But Bert kills Bill, the bully, very unceremoniously. And decides pretty much that he's going to go into politics. And he goes to the pub and he forms a vigilance committee, much to Wells' regret. And he settles down to a simple country life. But there's not much food anymore. There's a real struggle, and everything is quite lawless. Edna bears 11 children, 4 of whom die very early on. The last sentence in the chapters before the epilogue is, "They went the way of the flesh, year by year." And finally we get an epilogue set 30 years later where an elder man that I first thought to be Bert, but is actually Tom Smallways, is taking a young boy, who's Bert's son, sort of foraging around some ruins, and it's the ruins of the old aerodrome. And Tom eulogizes to the boy about the past and the motor cars and bicycles. Maybe he misses them now. And the Purple Death didn't only kill people, it also affected animals. And boy, whose name is Teddy, gets told a somewhat parochial tale of devils. And now it seems, Tom misses the days when he could see exotic fruits in his grocer's shop. And he describes the aerial chaos of the war. And he remembers his last customer, a man tried to give him a no-good check, and how a bunch of thugs showed up and hung him as a financier. And Teddy remarks that he saw his first hanging when he was 6. Now, Tom hunts cats for food. And there might still be war going on, but over there in Kent they see nothing, because they're far from everything. Somebody, somewhere, ought to have stopped something. But who or what or why? We're all beyond his ken. And that is the way the War in the Air ends. it's quite a journey.
Oh, yeah.
And I really enjoyed it for the most part.
This was great. And I think I like this one better than The Time Machine and First Man on the Moon, although I thought those were really good too. I like how bleak this gets at times. And one thing that I really liked about the plot is throughout the whole novel, well, most of the novel anyway, Bert has Butteridge's plans in his pocket, and it's almost like this MacGuffin or something that we think is going to develop the plot in some meaningful way.
Yeah.
Like he's going to turn it in, and the Americans are going to get the secret of the flying machine and turn the tide of the war and repel all the invasions, and everything is going to go back to normal. But that doesn't happen. The plans are totally useless in the long term, and society collapses anyway.
Yeah. I mean, even like where you were going with that, too, I thought that it could have come in a lot earlier because I thought the Germans were going to take advantage of it. And
well, yeah, right.
I don't know. If this had been another kind of book, somebody on the German side would have been feeding Bert things, and he would have been acting as Mr. Butteridge, pretending to be this aerial figure, right?
Right.
Where he's nothing of the kind.
Yeah.
And certainly that would have been quite the caper, but that's not this book.
Yeah.
And yeah, the plans are useless pretty much from the beginning. And of course, Butteridge takes them very seriously and dies of apoplexy when he doesn't have them. But nobody else. I mean, I even questioned what the Germans were hoping to do. I guess their idea was to establish a base in America and build them from there. I don't know. It didn't seem like they brought enough. I don't know. Like it seemed like the aeronautics park would be a better place for that kind of thing.
Right.
I don't know.
But I mean, in the way it kind of mirrors the real world events that would happen during World War I, where certain powers would take on first strikes, assuming they were just going to totally annihilate the enemy, and that would be it, not realizing that they would find all their forces totally entrenched in a foreign land and eventually chipped away in a war of attrition and destroyed. I mean, that happened when the Russians tried to invade Germany during World War I. They spectacularly failed. And they thought it was going to be a quick thing that would just be done by Christmas time. And you hear that a lot.
That's what they said.
Right.
Yeah.
And it really doesn't work that way. And even in the epilogue, we are still under the impression that war is going on all over the world still, that nothing has really changed. There's been back and forth skirmishes all along, and it's just totally collapsed society to the point where somebody in Kent would be completely unaware of the events going on even a couple of villages over. That society is totally collapsed to the point where it's the new Dark Ages. The scientific age is gone, and barbarism has returned. And he doesn't really belabor this point too much, but he also ties it to the rise of puritanical Christianity and this very authoritarian worldview that arises in the chaos.
Yeah, that's definitely true.
Yeah, that really only comes up in the latter couple chapters in the epilogue, but it's definitely, I think, the most harrowing point of the book is that we're really not that far away from a total collapse, and a new dark age is that civilization is fragile, and that everything we have, these high technological advancements, which in Wells' days were much more simple compared to the technology of today. I mean, in Wells' days, high technology was like a combustion engine, which is something that people can put together and fix in their garage. It's not like microchips that are fabricated on a nano scale. If some kind of disruptive event happened in today's society, I think it would be even more catastrophic, because Wells talks about how the scientific and engineering knowledge was greatly blunted in the apocalypse of this novel, but people still had some kind of skills that could get by in some capacity, whereas the technology of today is so ever present in everybody's life that a complete disruption of that would set things even more off the balance, I think.
Yeah, and it would probably be a bigger scale
Oh, absolutely.
catastrophe.
Yeah.
It would be a catastrophe that affects more people in a larger sphere more
Right.
quickly. So, I mean, yeah, and I think that Wells was a fan of a lot of the things that had been developing that he saw as rather positive.
Right.
And he was very worried about the possibility of all that being gone. And World War One hadn't happened yet. I mean,
Yeah.
the Great War was still 6 years away.
Right.
But knowing that these flying machines were being developed and knowing that, yeah, we're starting to get more destructive weapons now. I mean, just a few years later, apparently, and I haven't read this book yet, but it's in The World Set Free, Wells wrote a very similar story with atomic bombs, which were very theoretical at that point,
Yeah.
to say the least. The first atomic bomb was still 30 years away in 1913. But thinking about these things and thinking about the greatness of our civilization or what it could be and what it could achieve, and yet how much effort and resources we put into things that we know could end it so swiftly,
Sure.
is a very strange and unsettling irony of sorts. I think.
And I think he was very cognizant of the fact that often the first application of a new technology is to kill somebody else with it.
Yeah.
And he could see the practical use in wartime of giant airships dropping bombs on stuff below. And the way he describes New York being essentially flattened in Lower Manhattan and Broadway by these airships just bombing it, I think really captures the horror of what he foresaw as a potential use of new air technology.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. That is pretty much the element of the book that is literal science fiction at this point still, is the air technology. But obviously the speculations about how social collapse could happen is something that we see over and over again in many works of the genre.
Yeah, so this kind of reminded me in a way of War of the Worlds. I haven't read it in about 10 years, and we're going to cover it at some point later.
Yeah,
but
definitely.
I think he took the more fantastic fears present in that book of an invading Martian army and wanted to do something similar here, but wanted to ground it more into reality in a way that kind of reminded me of what Dickens did with some of the themes in The Christmas Carol versus what he did with Dombey and Son, of this basic idea of a rich miser having this redemption arc, but taking the earlier fantastical themes and almost entirely eliminating them. I mean, some of the airships in this are fantastical in a sense that they weren't in reality yet, but they weren't too far off. I mean, you could easily extend the technology at the time to the airships present in this work. Certainly more grounded in reality than the Martian, as you call them, pods walking around on stilts and things like that.
But one thing that definitely these books have in common, as well as the apocalyptic feeling, most of actually War in the World takes place completely in England.
Right.
But the apocalyptic feeling, as well as being similar, it has been argued that War of the Worlds is an anti-imperialist book, and he's essentially saying, well, what if someone tried to colonize us as we colonize? Yeah. And certainly something that was becoming more and more important to Wells, and he talks about that a lot in this book. And there's a pretty good passage early on, actually, in the book when Bert is still in England that illustrates this, and also perhaps gives some ideas of the kind of views Wells had on things like race, which I am going to read. Of all the productions of the human imagination that make the world in which Mr. Bert Smallways lived confusingly wonderful, there was none quite so strange, so headlong and disturbing, so noisy and persuasive and dangerous as the modernizations of patriotism produced by imperial and international politics. In the soul of all men is a liking for kind, a pride in one's own atmosphere, a tenderness for one's mother speech and one's familiar land. Before the coming of the scientific age, this group of gentle and noble emotions had been a fine factor in the equipment of every worthy human being, a fine factor that had its less amiable aspects in a usually harmless hostility to strange people, and a usually harmless detraction of strange lands. But with a wild rush of change in the pace, scope, materials, scale, and possibilities of human life, that then occurred. The old boundaries, the old seclusions and separations were violently broken down. All the old, settled mental habits and traditions of men found themselves not simply confronted by new conditions, but by constantly renewed and changing new conditions. They had no chance of adapting themselves. They were annihilated, or perverted, or inflamed beyond recognition. Bert Smallways' grandfather, in the days when Bun Hill was a village under the sway of Sir Peter Bones' parent, had known his place to the uttermost farthing, touched his hat to his betters, despised and condescended to his inferiors, and hadn't changed an idea from the cradle to the grave. He was Kentish and English, and that meant hops, beer, and the sort of sunshine that was best in the world. Newspapers and politics and visits to Lunnon weren't for the likes of him. Then came the change. These earlier chapters have given an idea of what happened to Bun Hill, and how the flood of novel things had poured over its devoted rusticity. Bert Smallways was only one of countless millions in Europe and America and Asia who, instead of being born rooted in the soil, were born struggling in a torrent they never clearly understood. All the faiths of their fathers had been taken by surprise, and startled into the strangest forms and reactions. Particularly did the fine old tradition of patriotism get perverted and distorted in the rush of new times. Instead of the sturdy establishment and prejudice of Bert's grandfather, to whom the word Frenchified was the ultimate term of contempt, there flowed through Bert's brain a squittering succession of thinly violent ideas about German competition, about the yellow danger, about the black peril, about the white man's burden. That is to say, Bert's preposterous right to muddle further the naturally very muddled politics of the entirely similar little cads to himself, except for a smear of brown, who smoked cigarettes and rode bicycles in Bulawayo, Kingston, Jamaica, or Bombay. These were Bert's subject races, and he was ready to die by proxy in the person of anyone who cared to enlist, to maintain his hold upon that right. It kept him awake at nights to think that he might lose it. And I don't know, I mean, there's a lot in that, and certainly on the face of it, it doesn't make Bert seem a very likable person from today's standpoint, but I think you have to realize that what Wells is trying to describe is sort of the struggle of a people coming up and how they're going to deal with these things and how to acknowledge the rights of people everywhere, which is something that mattered a lot to modern progressives of their time, like Herbert Wells.
Right. And one thing he really does here is capture the global sense of the catastrophe and how these, I guess, various attacks affect everybody. And he also captures this spirit of British imperialism in Bert, initially thinking it's this like glorious thing to die for your empire. But once Bert sees the horror of war firsthand, of men being sucked under the sea by sinking ships, or people dying these horrible fiery deaths in New York as they're being bombed above by Zeppelins, it stops being glorious very quick. And the end, where it just reverts to barbarism and Bert is just murdering people out of being this strong-armed thug, it's really shocking because he kind of has his conscience through the whole novel, but as society collapses and as norms collapse and every person has to fight for themselves to survive, Bert takes up violence as a way to deal with it, as that's now the law of the land.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that so long as he has men around him, like even Germans, he seems to be okay. Like his conscience is intact, and it's very scary and stuff. But at no point in the book, even though Kurt says, "Oh, wait till the men get some blood in them, and they'll be like ferocious killers." That's what they were meant to be. At no point do we actually see that among his fellows.
No, not at all.
At all. And it's really interesting. And then once he's alone, this is when he changes. And yeah, like that whole thing with going back home and shooting the guy who's after his sweetheart. It's funny the way Wells does it. Like, it's so perfunctory, and it's so, like, he takes no joy in it. Killing the prince was okay. Like, it kind of felt, I don't know, like, it felt earned, I guess, in a way. And even though, yeah, like, Bert was still traumatized by it, and it still affected him because it was his first kill. But, like, after he shoots this person, and his friend, actually, he shoots two guys, and then he goes to the pub, and he's like, confronts all these men in the pub, and he's basically, oh, I'm your leader now. And first they're like, oh, what about Bill? He's our leader.
Yeah.
And Bert literally, he says, Bill's dead. I just shot him. We don't need reckon with him. He's shot. And a red-haired chap with a squint, he's shot. We've settled up all that. There ain't going to be no Bill, ever. He got wrong ideas about marriage and things. It's his sort of chap we're after. And, like, this is the way Bert is now. And honestly, it's kind of sad.
Very Old West vigilante.
Yeah. It's like, it's turned into this Western thing, but it's like, not, yeah, it feels unsatisfying and not good.
He's a thuggish killer.
Right. And Wells pretty much says that. He says, well, this is what we've come to now.
Yep.
We've descended so quickly to the stage of barbarism where you have to fight over somebody that you love.
Right.
And that's really not good. And then you got them settling down to this country life and Edna bearing 11 children. Like, that wouldn't have been in the cards in 1908.
No, definitely not.
I mean, there was no need for that. But now, when your offspring are likely not to survive.
Yeah. Infant mortality is very high, and presumably there's no such thing as medicine.
Yeah, not much, I'm guessing. And certainly no international trade of goods.
No.
And yeah.
Nope. Only food products you're going to find are what can be grown or hunted in the English countryside.
So it's interesting, though, because a lot of the progress that Wells seems to admire came from the thing that he doesn't admire, which is the imperialistic spirit.
Yeah, right.
And he also, and this has been pointed out also by people who have studied Wells more, is that he did not see, even right up until the 30s, like, and it's arguable whether it's worth it, of course, but war does actually sort of help push progress along. And I mean, it has done that. And not just for warlike inventions.
Right.
So, I mean, it is possible to argue that some good things might come from these sorts of conflicts, so long as we don't destroy civilization in the process.
Yeah. Well, it certainly came close.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's really worth it necessarily that millions of civilians die. Like, I'm not saying that at all. But he just seems to have seen it as wholly negative, which is perhaps a healthy way to see it if you care about human life.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think it's not a very controversial statement to say that modern high technology pretty much all came out of World War II. I mean, you have the computer technology, you have the radar technology, you have jet engines, you have so much of the modern world that was originally developed to have military applications. Right. And it was the most destructive conflict in human history. And I think the scenarios that Wells described in this novel are much closer to how things played out in World War II than World War I.
Yeah, that's a good point.
There's a lot of even nuclear-era, Cold War, mutually assured destruction type apocalyptic fears that really become more commonplace in new wave science fiction. And probably some Golden Age stuff, too. But he's certainly way ahead of the curve there as far as that goes, of the potential human race destroying itself. Because this really is nothing like The Last Man, where a plague wipes through, and it's, kind of implied that it might be divinely sent, but here, humanity does it all to itself.
Yeah, and that seems to be the big fear, that we've come up with so much greatness, and yet we can still do this to ourselves. And because the story is told from the perspective of mostly smaller people, so to speak, not princes and generals so much, we don't really understand the reasoning behind a lot of things. And I think the reasoning itself is probably absurd. And it definitely seems like, especially in World War I, there was a lot of absurdity, actually.
Oh, yeah.
Like, there was a lot of things that didn't make sense that just happened, and maybe it was because people didn't understand the new nature of warfare, or maybe
I think that's a big part of it. And you have this last vestige of the old aristocracy trying to survive in an age where you have
guys like Kaiser Wilhelm in Germany who thought he was some great general, and he was actually like completely incompetent. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
And, I mean, the prince kind of reminds me of that.
Right. He's this like Bismarckian Kaiser type figure.
Well, Bismarck was actually a really good leader, though, whereas the Kaiser wasn't. At least that's always been my impression.
Well, I meant more as far as the nationalistic, imperialistic.
Right.
aims.
Yeah, they had that in common, definitely. Yeah. But I think the Kaiser Wilhelm was really a person who put on airs. You know, like he'd like to dress around in the uniform and pretend that he was one of the boys.
Yeah.
But he really wasn't. And he did not understand how war worked. Like, apparently he would organize, like, all sorts of drills for his officers. And, like, the things they had plans made no sense. And they had to go along with it because they were afraid to anger him and they knew there would be trouble. And so they just went along with it. And he assumed they would win all these conflicts and stuff. And they had no... It was really bad. It was really bad.
Yeah.
And I do feel that Karl Albert is a very good reflection of that kind of personality.
Yeah.
So this book definitely probably came across in the summary as being really, really grim. But there's actually a lot of humor in it. And some of it stems from that kind of absurdity. So it's morbid humor, perhaps. But there's also a lot of weird, like, fun slapstick stuff, especially in the beginning.
Yeah. But even at the end, when Bert, like, shoots those guys in an Old West type scenario. There's a third guy there, and he takes a shot at him, but he runs away in this like comic type cartoon way, like in a Roadrunner cartoon, is kind of what I was picturing there.
Yeah,
but, yeah, it's kind of an odd juxtaposition there.
Yeah, and he's like, his girl is really happy to see him, and she's like, "Well, there's something I need you to take care of," and he sees like this guy coming up the path through the window, and he's like, "That him?"
Yeah.
And she nods, and that's it.
He just plugs him in the head. Yeah. Yeah.
Just over. Yeah. And then he shoots the other guy in the chest.
Right.
And it's like, again, way nastier and more gory.
Yeah.
And so he kind of describes that. But yeah. And there's some really funny stuff at the beginning with Grubb and Bert. And there's this funny scene where Bert tries to get a dog for the bicycle shop. And it really made me laugh. And then there was the whole thing where Bert was up in the balloon. I can't really describe it. That scene was like, nothing really happened. I mean, Bert was kind of figuring out his circumstances.
Yeah.
But that whole set of chapters was great to read. It was just
absolutely.
So much fun.
Yeah.
And, you know, he's like finding these erotic letters. And Wells doesn't tell us what's in the letters, but he said, you can be rest assured that Bert read them.
Yeah.
And, and it's like...
Yeah.
It's just like, the erotic letters were good, trust me.
Right.
But they were also kind of not good.
Yeah. Wells is just a good writer, and he has not only a good way of propelling the plot and really sucking you in, but he has a good way of putting things, like his little asides where he goes on these tangents about imperialism and the nature of changing technologies and what that means for society. I think were very relevant, and they never felt like he was trying to pad out the word count or anything like that. They really felt like they flowed in and out of the story in a natural fashion, and he's very good at what he does. Yeah,
they never felt ham-fisted. The only one that did was towards the end where he was describing all the apocalyptic scenes.
Yeah.
Like, it's kind of funny because all the political asides, I didn't mind that. I was like, okay, well, tell us what you think. Like, I'm here to listen. It's fine.
Yeah.
These apocalyptic stories have been the rage for so long. I think I'm just kind of a little bored with them right now.
Right.
It sounds kind of desensitized, but it's just like, all right, like, yeah, it was really bad. There was lots of destruction and famine.
Right.
And what else can you say, right? I mean, I don't know. I wouldn't want to live through that.
No, certainly
not. Don't get me wrong. But, like, it's a really small part. And towards the end, you just fall into that feeling of how everything has become lawless and like so quickly too.
Yeah.
That's another thing, like it's so fast and I'm not actually sure if the timing in the book works. Like it's said at some point that only a fortnight has passed since Bert left England and like we're already in Niagara at this point and I'm like, wait, 2 weeks? Really?
Yeah, I think that was about the time span because they're stranded in Labrador for like 5 or 6 days. Yeah. And it takes them that long to get the wireless telegraph things set up, but once they're able to radio for help, he's in Niagara in a couple hours.
Yeah, well, it doesn't say how long it's been, but that's just it. I didn't really think that much about time until he said it's been a fortnight. And wait, 2 weeks? Because he says at one point that the Zeppelin, the Hohenzollern, or however you pronounce that, is out in the Rockies.
Yeah.
Like, that's way on the other side of North America. Like, And here's the other thing. Wells, he wrote about aircrafts before this. He has a set of stories, linked stories, but the one called A Story of the Days to Come, he talks about people traveling, like, it's more of a civilian travel, though, by aircraft. And one thing I noticed is that I think that he consistently underestimates the speed at which these things will be able to go in the future. So considering that he's actually underestimating the speed, it seems that things happen rather fast. And it's fine, but it's just something that I questioned as I was reading it. Like, the timing doesn't quite seem right. Like, it does seem like it should take a little longer than this, like maybe a few months at least.
Yeah, right.
But again, if that had been the case, I'm sure the Germans would have thrown him off the ship, because I kept wondering when the prince was just going to be like, "You there, jump overboard!"
Yeah.
And I marveled throughout at how nice the Germans were being to him, despite the fact that they're always portrayed as being these, like, almost ridiculously warlike people. Again, that's not really what we see on the ship among the everyday soldiers. They're not like that at all.
No.
And I think it's interesting because in a lot of war stories, like, we see people being sort of corrupted by the warlike spirit and turning into, like, this mob of killers, right? And sure, we see that in a detached way. We see that that's what the hordes of soldiers are doing from Asia, for instance, maybe. But we don't see that among the men that Bert's with, even though he actually spends a little bit of time thinking about how he's a traitor. Like, he does think about that at one point. But he thinks about it and then puts it aside because he realizes that at this point it's not going to do him any good. And he's got to actually try and be cool with these people because he's up in the air and he has no way to get down. And if he did, what the hell would he do anyway?
Yeah,
right.
He needs to survive.
So, and he is a survivor, right? And he gets done what needs to get done. And in the end, that results in Bert becoming a cold, hard killer, telling his brother Tom that his son needs to get blooded.
Right.
And he does this when his son is like 8.
Yeah, very early.
So that's what it's come to. And I really do feel like I liked the earlier Bert more. You know, even though he was a more simple person, probably.
I mean, he had a sense of humanity. And that humanity seems to die when Kurt dies. And I think Kurt is portrayed as the most, I guess, humanistic character in the book. I mean, he has a lot of empathy and sympathy and kind of self-awareness. And when he dies and Bert feels totally alone, it seems like Bert's humanity goes with it.
Yeah. Kurt's not like that at first. He has this front at first of being the sharp Teutonic soldier.
Right.
But that doesn't last very long. And I think the fact that Bert and him are cabin mates through most of this, I mean, again, it does seem to happen very quickly, but they become, or at least Kurt confides in him a lot. And Bert does too, but Bert is very unassuming. Like, he doesn't have any illusions about militarism or anything like that. So he just kind of listens, I think, and every now and then makes an observation or, like, wows at the ship design, which is really cool, actually.
Oh, absolutely.
It almost reminded me more of Verne, actually.
Yeah.
Just the way Wells actually goes into the ship.
Yeah.
And this Vaterland is a real marvel of design. And at one point, he describes the conduits and tubes in the airship as being sort of like the blood vessels and circulatory system of the human body.
Right.
And it's a neat metaphor for sure. And it definitely feels like something you will see in later works of science fiction when people describe things like fantastic ships and stuff like that. As being almost like living organisms.
Yeah. I think one of the best parts of the book is after the German air fleet bombs New York, the Vaterland gets hit by some kind of shell from like an anti-aircraft gun or something like that, and when it's disabled and spins adrift, and a good chunk of the cabin and habitable part of the ship is just gone, and Bert has to make his way through this like damaged set of corridors to find everybody else, and it's super dangerous because there's lots of parts that are exposed to the elements, and he has to make these like really risky jumps and navigate through like disorienting terrain because the perspective is shifted.
Yeah,
it's a
really hard to walk or even move.
Exactly.
And
yeah. Really
It's
well
really
done part.
harrowing. It's really scary, and you think like Bert kind of needed to become the hardened person that he became just because of all the things that he had to endure.
Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, yeah, it's ultimately sort of grim, yes, but I do think that Wells puts enough levity into it to make some of it genuinely fun. And for the first half, you really think that this is just going to be this fun adventure caper.
Right.
And it turns into this. I think it's actually quite neat the way he lulls you into this sense of security. And you actually speculated that maybe he had written the earlier part at a different time. Apparently not.
Yeah, like the first couple chapters before, I guess, Bert gets in the air, where it's kind of this extended prologue of him in the bike shop and things like that. It felt like it may have been written later, but I guess it wasn't.
No, well, I mean, it's possible that he had it hiding around in a drawer somewhere, but he said that he completed the whole book in 4 months, so it couldn't have been much of a delay, I guess. And I think it's a good background. I mean, it doesn't have a lot to do with what happened later in the story, but I think that there we have one of the main differences between a book like this and the one we're about to cover.
Oh, yeah.
Which is a way more perfunctory sort of story that doesn't have any of the character beats that this one had.
No, not at all. But no, this one was great. And once it really gets going, it really sucked me in, and I found it very difficult to put down. I mean, this was really, really engaging, dark, and an intelligent look at the themes.
Yes, I definitely think so. I don't know if I like this more than The First Men in the Moon, but I can see how this one has a certain resonance with everything around it and its time and place.
Oh, yeah.
But also the future. And also, it's kind of some war stories, even though they are set specifically in a time and place, they definitely have a certain timeless quality to them. And you feel that they might apply to things in the future, and they might apply to things that are happening now. And you kind of see the sort of absurdity to which many of the world's leaders are sometimes prone into descending, and how they really have us in the palm of our hands, and that shouldn't probably be. That probably shouldn't be like that. Probably should have different people in charge.
Right.
Right? And, okay, it's not King Leopold and Kaiser Wilhelm and George V anymore, but it's still bad. Mm-hmm. And let's not delude ourselves that we're so much better now 120 odd years later. Because I don't know that that's true. And no, I mean,
people don't really change that much, even though the technologies and the societies might.
Yeah, they don't. People remain the same. And hopefully we can learn to do things better. And I think that Wells might, if he had been alive today, he might be impressed at some things. He might be impressed at some of what we've managed to achieve. Maybe. It's hard to say.
Yeah.
Certainly, when you think about people who... There is a story about that. There's a movie, Time After Time, actually, that has Malcolm McDowell playing H.G. Wells going into the late 20th century. And he has to fight Jack the Ripper, though, so he doesn't really have time to muse that much on social speculation.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good movie, but it's kind of weird because, like, I don't know. I mean, it's a better use of Herbert Wells than what Doctor Who did in the 80s.
Yeah.
It's still kind of strange. Like, the idea is that he developed a time machine, and somehow he ended up in San Francisco in the 70s, and David Warner as Jack the Ripper, and he also escaped there. And, it's weird, but it's fun. It's a good movie.
I never saw that one. I might have to check that out.
No, it's cool, but I don't know. Somehow McDowell doesn't quite seem like I pictured Wells.
Yeah.
Because the way that even, like, people talk about him delivering, because he liked to talk and he liked to make speeches and stuff, and some people made fun of him for the way he talked, and he has this, like, he's always depicted as having this sort of high-pitched piping voice, and it's kind of coupled with his things like his sexual adventurousness and stuff kind of paints a funny picture sometimes. Right. As this Englishman with this goofy sounding high voice that really likes to hang out with ladies and have lots of fun and stuff, and like polyamorous and all that. It's just kind of, it's an odd picture kind of, but an interesting person with a lot to say and a lot of relevance, I think. And it will definitely be a pleasure to return to him in the future of Chrononauts.
Yep, which we definitely will be many times.
Yeah, I think it might be time to move on to something far less realistic and far more incredible.
Yes.
In the literal sense of the word.
Yep.